Good morning. Ezekiel 23. This begins with a parable, runs through the whole chapter. It's a very long chapter. I don't know whether we'll get through it. It's probably one of the, in several places, one of the most graphic illustrations of carnality in the Bible. And people read it and they wonder, what does that mean? What it means is exactly what it says. And it is that graphic that hardly anybody wants to even begin describing it. That's what happens to the people of Israel when they took their eyes off of the Lord and began looking around, wanting to be like other people, wanting to be like the nations. God chose them out of Egypt, chose them out of all of the peoples and all of the families of the world to be a representative of Himself. They were supposed to stand out. They were supposed to be different. They were supposed to be attracted, if you will, to the rest of the world. And what they became was corrupt and wanted to be like everybody else. So, in Ezekiel 23, the word of the Lord came again unto me. This is Ezekiel speaking what God's words were to him. Son of man, there were two women, the daughters of one mother. So they have a similar origin, same mother. And they committed whoredoms in Egypt. They committed whoredoms in their youth. There were their breasts pressed. They were bruised the teats of their virginity. You see what I mean? This starts out with Israel as a young woman. The illustration in the parable here is of Israel and Samaria as a young woman. Israel and Samaria are, how would I describe this? Israel is the nation. Samaria became a geographical separation of that. We'll look at it a little bit, how they became that. But it was typically the southern two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and then the northern 10 tribes. This ultimately was, in the deportation of Israel into Assyria, became a split that was never healed. It came in Solomon's son Rehoboam's day, back in the book of Kings. The split was never healed. Even to this day, there's still a major schism there. When Israel, the northern 10 tribes, came back from Assyria in their captivity, they came back an extremely corrupt nation. If there's anything that America should learn, it is by looking at the Bible and learning what corrupts a nation. Polytheism, polyculturalism, multilingual people, each one gravitates to their own. There is no unity. They can boast of diversity, but in diversity is the same level of weakness that 10-toed image of Daniel has. It has no cohesive strength. It becomes a land of tribalism. So they're just fractured, fragmented in this situation. And God begins detailing all of the problems that what brought them to this thing. It's interesting, in the preaching service this morning, what God wants unsaved people to know. And the churches are unwilling to tell them because it seems unfriendly, and yet the kindest thing you could do is tell somebody what their problems are. You go to a doctor, you don't pay that guy $125 to say, oh, you're fine when you feel like a bag of used laundry. You want him to tell you what the problem is so you can fix it. You can go to the remedy. So anyway, the description of Israel and Judah, these are the northern and the southern tribes under the guise of Samaria, are given as a pair of sisters. If anybody grew up with sisters, you realize that the older ones teach the younger ones learn from the older ones, and the habits of one typically become the habits of the other until one excels at something and they become the object of either jealousy or animosity. They're kind of like brothers. A brother, the Bible says, is born for adversity. Sisters are similar to those kind of things. All right, if you got a question, stick your hand up. This is a bit roundabout the way that it's approached, but it really comes down to God describing the nation of Israel under the two characters that it has become. the southern tribes down where the temple is, and the northern tribes that were steeped in idolatry almost from the very beginning. Verse 4, and the names of them were Aholah the elder, and Aholabah her sister. That's the younger. And they were mine, and they bare sons and daughters. Thus were their names. Samaria is Aholah, and Jerusalem is Aholabah. So we're not left to guess at what these parables are about and who they are. They're certainly identified. Samaria, well, let me start with Aholah. Aholah is Samaria, and it means her tent. You say, what does that mean? Where she dwells. You dwell where your tent is. It's like your house. You may not live there every second, but it's your house. That's characteristic of you. Aholabah is Jerusalem, and that's my tent is there. Aholabah is the city. If you think, why is the Bible relevant? I've got a lot of loose ends in this stuff. But if you think, why is the Bible relevant? Anybody know what determines the price of oil? It's typically the Arab nations through OPEC and all of their tentacles. America's somewhat moving into the control of all those kind of things. But if we wanted cheaper oil, all we'd have to do is dump Israel. If we wanted to have better relationship with the Middle East, all we'd have to do is dump Israel. If we wanted to have better relations in Washington, D.C., with between the communists and the Americans, all we'd have to do is dump Israel. So when you think about what is one of the controlling issues of the entire American political scheme, economic scheme, and the world scheme as that goes, if you wanted to be a superstar in the United Nations, all you'd have to do is go along with the other 180-something nations that denounce Israel for their treatment of people that are trying to blow up all their children. Israel is God's interest in this world. Israel is where God set his house, the temple. Israel is where God says, there will I put my presence, that if you want to meet me, come there, and I will satisfy your curiosity. So when you think about that, God sets his tent in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem becomes the focal point of the world. So Jerusalem, in every interest of society, becomes something that God has a vested interest in. So all of you think, how in the world does something so small as that one city have such a controlling interest of the world? That's God's city. God set his tent there. He put a tabernacle there. He put a tent there. He put a temple there. He rebuilt the temple after Israel apostatized and then rebuilt it, because God is involved with that. If you couldn't believe in God for any other reason, look at the history of the Jews, and you would have to believe that there's a God that did exactly what he said he would do, and we've got to find out who he is. All right, so verse 4, chapter 23, verse 4, going on, the names of Samaria is Aholah, Jerusalem is Aholabah, and these two sisters are going to be characterized by their habits, their attitudes, their penchant for corruption and sin. And Aholah, that's Samaria, played the harlot when she was mine, and she doted on her lovers, on the Assyrians, her neighbors. So that was the Assyrians. Syria is a big part of what was the Assyrian Empire. It kind of went from there east, north of Israel. They were the first superstate, I guess you could say, that took Israel away under God's command. They corrupted themselves, and God sent nations to deport them, to, in a sense, send them to the corner to learn and be chastised, and then God allowed them to come home. The second one, and by the way, she got carried away with the Assyrians, and as we read through this, I hate to spend so much commentary on it, but I doubt seriously most people are that fluent in what the Assyrian Empire was all about and what the Assyrians were up to all this time. Verse 6 talks about how the Assyrians portrayed themselves, which were clothed in blue, captains and rulers, all of them desirable young men, horsemen, riding upon horses. So they're powerful, influential, militant kind of people. They're well-dressed, well-fitted out, and it impressed Israel. Israel was not impressed with God, they were impressed with what their eyeballs saw, and that's the end of it. Thus, she committed her whoredoms with all them that were chosen men of Assyria, and with all on whom she doted, with all their idols, she defiled herself. This idea of idolatry goes as far back in human history as you can possibly go historically, biblically. It goes back even further than that. But it's interesting that most idolatry comes down to people worshiping animals. If they don't worship animals, they worship sort of a composite animal of man. And I think if you can remember when we did some studies in Genesis 2, 3, 4, and 5, when Adam sinned and God put he and Eve out of the garden, he put a cherub with a flaming sword to guard the entrance to the tree of life, lest man in his sinfulness should breathe forth his hand, take of the fruit of the tree of life, and eat and live forever, in a sin-filled, corrupted state. From our study of Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10, you understand what the looks of those cherub were. The face that would be, the head was described as four faces: a man, a bird, an ox, and a lion. But the one that was on the front, if you could see it looking at you, the one you see is the face of an ox. You say, well, what in the world does that have any relationship to anything else in the world? How many nations worship a bull? Most did. American Indians used to have that bull's head for power. You look at all of the crowns and all of the things that the devil's always portrayed with horns, because that's a symbol of power and authority. But they could go by and see that cherub there with this flaming sword, this supernatural being. So he becomes sort of the emblematic of the supernatural power that can be seen and can be observed, as opposed to God, who is invisible but holds the real power. So they're caught up in all these things. So most idolatry comes down to that. When Israel came out of Egypt, they were worshiping the golden calves. That calf always takes a preeminent place. The cherubs had cloven feet like a calf. So you see the devil always portrayed as sort of a man, which is what the cherubs essentially look like, with a sort of a sneaky looking face on him, but he would have a cherub's face, an ox, and cloven feet. So you see Pan, the flute musician of the Etruscans and all that. In every culture that you go, you find exactly the same thing, which tells the similarities going back to God's description of what a cherub was and what men could learn from them by history, by the Bible, by observation, and it became corrupted as time went on. All right, so they're idols. Today, idols are used in religions as aids to worship. They're used as objects to catch your attention. Shiny, dazzling things and little dollies dressed up like extravagant things are what the pagans have always used to keep your attention focused on what's visible or what you can see and what you can touch, as opposed to the invisible God, who's the author of creation and calls us to be faithful to Him. They are mad upon their idols. Verse 8, neither left she her whoredoms brought from Egypt, for in her youth they lay with her, and they bruised the breast of her virginity, and poured their whoredoms upon her. Israel's apostasy, Samaria's apostasy, started early on. They came out of Egypt, and it's like a lot of Christians. They may get saved, but they seldom get very far out of the world. They want to keep in just enough so that they don't look too strange. They don't want to look too separated. They don't want to look too different. because somebody might point a finger at him and say, were you one of those crazy Christians? If you remember in the book of Acts, it says that the Romans took knowledge of the Christians that they had been with Jesus. Jesus always leaves an imprint on people's lives when he's real to them, when he takes on the lordship of their life. That's not religion, that's salvation. That's the imprint God puts upon his people. All right, so verse 9. Wherefore, now, God never judges without warning. These people were warned over and over and over again what would come. They were warned in their covenant with God. And, way back in Deuteronomy 28, in Moses' day, that if they obeyed, they would eat the fruit of the land and be blessed, and if they disobeyed, they would be carried away captive to the nations. God says, I'm going to prove to you that I am a God of my word. Our confidence as saved people rests in the fact that God has promised us everlasting life through Jesus Christ. The world looks at it and says, well, you know, that's what you think. No, that's what he said. I believe that, therefore I can have it. Trust in God. The world thinks, no, you've got to earn it, you've got to deserve it, you've got to this, that, and the other thing, and never take part of it. All right, so God makes a conclusion about their behaviors. Wherefore I have delivered her into the hand of her lovers, into the hand of the Assyrians, upon whom she doted. We spend so much time in the Old Testament because the Old Testament is a good illustration of how God deals with nations. And our founding fathers were well connected with the Bible. Even those who weren't saved were more familiar with the Bible than most professing Christians and most preachers are today. They understood God's dealing with the nations by faith, by obedience, by law, by a spiritual example. And they said, if we pattern our country after that, we will be blessed. And America has been up until probably in the 1910s, 1920s, when America went to a world war and brought back all of the corrupt habits of France. It began a deterioration. Now, it's not to blame France. The problem was that churches were already beginning to apostatize because of Marxism from the 1860s. But it accelerated all of those things. Anyway, verse 10. These discovered her nakedness. These are the Assyrians. They discovered her nakedness. They took her sons and her daughters and slew her with a sword, and she became famous among women, for they had executed judgment upon her. Infamous might be another word that you'd use. It's like looking at a harlot and saying, wow, look at her. Not as a, wow, what a great life. You know, just people dying around her, making a mess of everybody's life, the kids are a mess. It's just the infamy that goes along with that manner of life. Today it's categorized as stardom and public success, and the bigger the whore you can be, I guess the more acceptable you are to society, the quicker you can reach the $1 million status. But it just shows you what God thinks of money. Look at who allows to have it. Verse 11, and her sister, now turns to the other one. And her sister Aholibah saw this. Jerusalem sees this. Now Jerusalem is where the predominant majority of the priests lived. This is where the temple was. This is where the nations flowed into during the feast and celebrations and stuff. And it was the more notable place of God's presence. And you think, well, they'd really be caught up with God. No, they're caught up with the religion. But they began with wandering eyes looking at how the rest of the world lived. And before you realize it, they're forgetting what God's done for them as a nation, bringing them out of bondage. And they're looking, well, we want to be like them. This idea of coveting the wicked has got a deadly end to it. I think that's the downfall of today's society. They set the wicked in great estate and pattern children. Don't you want to be an NBA star? Don't you want to be a football star? Don't you want to... No, I've seen what their lives are. I don't want to be that corrupt. They can't keep a job. They can't keep a family. They can't keep their independence. They can't keep their mind. They can't keep their sanity. They can't keep their sobriety. They can't keep anything. They're just very destructive people. Talented, yes. You want to be one of them? fine. You want to set them up as the standard for your children, for your family? You're heading in a very bad direction. Verse 11, when her sister Aholibah saw this, she was more corrupt in her inordinate love than she. This is a very adulterous relationship. God is to be the husband of Israel. God is to be the one that gives them direction. And they turned her back on that God. And in her whoredoms more than her sister in her whoredoms. You know, you wonder why do people not like the Bible? Because the Bible knows you. The Bible tells all about who you are, who we are as people, who our nations are as national entities. And He gives the warnings that no one wants to hear. In this morning's preaching message, you think about the question often arises, why are there so many denominations? As men reject more and more of the Bible, they need to create more and more Bibles that dilute God's Word down to where it's an acceptable level of truth to the corrupt society in which they live, and you finally end up with one that has God being put out of the Bible. Some of the new Bible put actually God, Jesus, Christ, Lord, Holy Spirit out of it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. They don't even want Him to be present in there because it becomes a book of just sort of relative moralism. We've gone to the Jesuit level of the end is justified by the means. Verse 12, she doted upon the Assyrians, her neighbors, captains and rulers, and remember, she was supposed to be the example of them. Rulers clothed most gorgeously, horsemen riding upon horses, all of them desirable young men. She saw things exactly the same way that Samaria did. She didn't see them as corrupt heathen destroying people. Anybody ever read anything about the Assyrians? The Assyrians were some of the most feared people in history. They were very educated, which shows you that education was a very slippery slope. Anybody know what the most educated society in history has been? Nazi Germany. They had a 99% literacy rate. Nazi Germany. How did you get people that are that intelligent to lock up that many people, murder that many people, destroy that many people, set the world on fire, and destroy their country twice? Because there's something about that level of intelligence that thinks, I don't care what God says, I am smarter than Him. I will show Him. It becomes an idol. When your brain becomes more important to you and what you think more important than what God says, you are ready for destruction, and the Lord can use the simplest, most basic things to accomplish it. In your pride, you will cut your own throat. Verse 13, then I saw that she was defiled, that they took both one way. Same problem. Society always has the same problem. The lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. It seeps in there, and that's why there are no second-generation Christians. Every person must be born again. You don't inherit anything from grandparents other than maybe an attendance at church. You don't inherit a spiritual life from grandparents or parents. You get that by maybe observing them and then creating one with God on your own. Verse 14, that she increased her whoredoms, for when she saw men portrayed upon the wall the images of the Chaldeans portrayed with vermilion. Let me ask you something. What do you see on your wall? I mean, don't you have something on your wall that shows you pictures? You know what it's designed for? Make you so covetous that you can't live without whatever it is they're going to sell you. The whole idea of television, it kind of started out as, boy, what a great instrument for instruction and teaching and communication. Yeah, that's true. It could be that. One day God will use it where the whole world will see the Antichrist. So it'll be that way one day. But in the meantime, it's the greatest tool that advertisers have ever used. Social media. Anybody know what that's for? for advertising. The more you're on there, the more they learn about you, the more they can send you advertisements of what it is that interests you and what they can sell you. You become the actual product of those things. We were joking about getting magazines and catalogs in the paper. You buy something from any mail order catalog, any telephone category, any internet, any TV thing, and your name goes on a list that is highly saleable and collectible because they know they've got your attention. You can be bought. So all of these things are basically a merchandising gimmick. When we get to Ezekiel 28, you'll see a little bit of why that is. The devil is the master of merchandise. And it comes down to the tribulation period where the devil makes merchandise of men's souls. That's what he's really after. If he can catch your eye, if he can catch your heart, he can catch your soul. So people are really caught up in all this stuff. And there's no time to look at the Bible. So they saw all these things and their eyes betrayed them. That's why when in Numbers 33 and verse 52, God told them when Israel came out of Egypt into the promised land where the Canaanites were, he said, destroy all their pleasant pictures. You think, wow, what a wanton destruction of artwork. They were nearly all pornographic. They were nearly all designed to get you in some sort of a mental state where that's all that you can think about. Kind of like soap operas and movies and all that kind of stuff. Well, nothing's changed. The one thing you learn from the Bible is that men are always the same. There is no such thing as evolution. There's no such thing as we're making great advances in all of these things. Man is still basically a corrupt creature, dead in trespasses and sins until he's regenerated in Jesus Christ. So, verse 15, girded with girdles upon their loins, exceeding in dyed attire upon their heads, all of them princes to look at, after the manner of the Babylonians of Chaldea, the land of their nativity. That's where the Assyrians came from. That is, if you listen to any of the historical narrative, that is the land of, that the scientists, so-called, believe is the cradle of civilization. So they looked at, they really had it. They had perfected writing as soon as men showed up. They had perfected artwork as soon as men showed up. They had perfected geographical understandings the minute men showed up. Adam was created with what's called an eidetic memory. He had all of this stuff in him already. It's like buying a computer. You turn it on and everything's in there. You just got to figure out how to use it. You don't add anything to that. You just figure out how to use what's there. That's Adam. All of the great machinery and all that kind of stuff. Think about this. I was watching something the other day. They come up with all this crazy stuff about how they built the pyramids and how they cut these obelisks. Imagine a piece of stonework in the second millennium BC that is 150, 200 feet long, that's probably 15, 20 feet square, and it's cut out a piece of a solid rock in a hole in the ground. How are you going to get that 20, 30 miles over there and stand it up? These people were not dumb. You know, this idea of the troglodyte caveman, people lived in caves after the flood. They lived in gigantic cities built out of stone before that. They developed all kinds of metallurgy and all kinds of things. God only knows what they had done and how they moved those things. But it's interesting, you can still see of them cut out of the rock. They're still laying there, right? Still joined to the rock. The question becomes, how do they do it? Who knows? Might have had technology you don't know. Verse 16, and as soon as she saw them with her eyes, she doted upon them. That's all it takes. The Bible says the eye is the light of the body. You fill that up with a corrupt light, that's all you see. You fill it up with dollar signs, that's all you see. You fill it up with sports, that's all you see. You fill it up with games, that's all you see. No room left for anything else to come in. Verse 16, as soon as she saw them with her eyes, she doted upon them and sent messengers unto them to Chaldea. Come over here. And the Babylonians came to her unto the bed of love. And that's given this, again, this is a parable